Welcome to Mushroom Growing Made Easy. In this 1-hour program, we will learn general techniques for propagating and fruiting mushrooms at home. Among the edible mushrooms that can be grown with the methods shown in this video are Psilocybe cubensis. Psilocybe cubensis are just one of the many species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin and psilocin, two psychoactive substances that make them hallucinogenic. Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms, which are also known as Cubensis stropharia, are likely the most commonly grown mushroom among home cultivators. This is probably because they were so easy to grow. Mushrooms containing psilocybin and psilocin have been used recreationally and ritualistically for thousands of years. So, unlike many modern chemical drugs, the test of time has proven species such as cubensis to be relatively harmless and non-toxic when used in moderation. Nobody has ever been known to overdose on them. However, because they are so powerfully psychoactive, care and responsibility are always key when it comes to using them safely. Anyone who has limited experience with hallucinogenic mushrooms should not take for granted or underestimate their psychoactive power. Magic mushrooms must be respected. Furthermore, the production of psilocybin and psilocin is illegal in many countries, including Canada and the US. If you grow Psilocybe cubensis, do it in a country where it is not illegal. Also, many species of mushrooms are highly poisonous, so finding mushrooms in the wild or buying them on the black market can be dangerous unless you are an expert who can identify them beyond any doubt. For these reasons, buying spores from reputable suppliers and growing them at home is the safest method of obtaining them. Even then, care must be taken during the cultivation process so that no contaminations develop. Contaminated mushrooms may also pose a personal health risk to the user. However, this is easy enough to deal with if you know what to look for. Taking a little time and care is all that is needed to ensure that you can grow and eat edible mushrooms and be safe. All of what you will see in this video can be done at home without any expensive equipment. The only major item that you will need, besides mushroom spores, is a pressure cooker. A small one, brand new, will cost $60 or $70 at a department store. Mushrooms need very little space and very little light. So, unlike growing plants, electricity consumption is next to nothing. As well, contrary to what most people believe, with most grow methods, there is no need for manure or smelly composts. There are two main goals for the mushroom cultivator to achieve. One is to recreate, at home, the environmental conditions that allow mushrooms to flourish in nature. For example, the jar shown here contains a certain amount of nutrients, a certain amount of humidity, and will be stored at a certain temperature. Now, while these conditions are ideal for mushroom fungus, they are also ideal for countless other types of bacteria and fungus. That's where the other goal comes in. The second goal of the mushroom cultivator is to protect this ideal environment from contamination. If any such organisms, other than the intended mushroom fungus, do find their way into this jar, and they will try, then there is little chance that the mushroom fungus will survive. That is why so much attention is paid to sterile techniques in mushroom cultivation. The life cycle of a mushroom begins when thousands of spores are released from the gills of a mature mushroom before it dies. The spore is the beginning point of the life cycle. Spores that germinate will grow silky white fungus called mycelium. When the mycelium of two compatible spores meet, their genetic makeups are combined to create a secondary mycelium, which will expand further and eventually become the physical and nutritional foundation on which fruit bodies will grow. The fruit bodies are the actual mushrooms. When the fruit bodies become fully developed, they will drop thousands of spores, and thus the cycle continues. Starting with a spore print or syringe, the entire growth cycle for Psilocybe cubensis can be as short as 8 weeks from start to finish, if conditions are ideal. First, you will mix a suitable substrate and use it to fill several jars. The substrate is what the mushroom fungus will feed off, and usually is a simple mixture of water and rye seed, or water, vermiculite, and rice flour. Many other mixtures can be used, but these two are the most common. The substrate jars are then sterilized to kill any viruses, bacteria, or funguses that are certain to be laced heavily within the substrate. Sterilization is done with a pressure cooker. It is after this step that sterile technique is so important so that the substrate remains free of any rival organisms. Sterile technique means taking certain precautions and doing things in such a way that the substrates will not be exposed to any contaminants. More on sterile technique in a moment. When the jars have cooled down after the sterilization process, the mushroom spores can be introduced. This is called inoculation. Inoculate the jars by injecting them with a spore syringe or by dropping in a scraping from a spore print or a piece of live tissue. This will cause the mushroom fungus to eventually grow all over the substrate. In order for it to grow fast, however, the substrate jar must be incubated. This means simply to keep it somewhere that is clean, dark, and warm. Soon, mycelium will begin to appear around the inoculation points. For the next 2 to 4 weeks, the whitish mycelium will continue to grow until it covers all of the substrate in the jar. When mycelium covers the entire substrate, the substrate jar is said to be fully colonized. A rice flour substrate, once fully colonized, will become a single solid mass, sort of like a cupcake. Rice flour substrates are then removed from the jar and put into a terrarium. A terrarium is a container that will let in light but keep in humidity. A fish aquarium with a plexiglass lid or a sealable plastic bin is perfect. If proper humidity is not retained, then the substrate will dry up and the mycelium will die. Once in the terrarium for 2 to 3 weeks, fruit bodies, the actual mushrooms, will begin to grow. Mushrooms can be eaten fresh or properly dried for storage. More experienced growers may choose to use a substrate made of water and rye seed. This is different from flour and vermiculite because with rye seed, even after it is colonized, it comes apart easily. All the grower needs to do is shake the jars every few days to keep the substrate crumbled. This is useful because it can be poured into trays where it is fruited, or else used to inoculate more jars. A fully colonized jar can be used to inoculate another 10 substrate jars of the same size. This makes it possible to increase your mycelium supply at an exponential rate, and is a common method used for bulk growing. Because the pattern of mycelial growth can be an indication of its fruiting potential, experienced growers select and isolate certain segments of mycelium and discard others. Isolating a single mycelium strain is an extra step that most growers consider necessary for ensuring optimum yields through quality control. Isolating a strain is not essential, however, especially for most basic grow methods. More on selecting and isolating strains later. The biggest challenge faced by the mycologist is to fight, or better yet, prevent, contamination. In mycology, the object is to provide mushroom spores with ideal conditions to grow. However, these same conditions are enjoyed by countless other organisms which may compete with our mushrooms for nutrients. Any other organism that gets a foothold in our mushroom culture is considered a contamination. In order to cultivate mushrooms without getting contaminations, each step of the process must employ a certain degree of what is called sterile technique. Most amateur growers can expect at least some of their cultures to become contaminated. Even experienced growers expect the occasional contamination. Most contaminations will be evident by the presence of strange odors or discolorations. The most common contamination is green penicillin mold. If contamination does occur, there is usually no remedy, so prevention is key. Contaminated culture can lead to toxic mushrooms that may be poisonous if consumed. It is not worth it to try to salvage a contaminated culture. Even disposing of a contaminated culture should be done carefully because it could be dangerous to inhale. The biggest potential source for contaminants comes from the substrate itself. Flour or rye seed will contain thousands of fungal and bacterial spores. That is why they need to be sterilized. Sterilization kills these spores. However, after sterilization, they are still vulnerable to contaminants that are in the air or that lie in wait on skin, clothing, hair, tools, and in fabrics. Before being used, tools should be sterilized. Do this with adequate heat or disinfectant. Skin and hair should be clean, and clothing should be newly laundered when handling substrates in mushroom cultures. Wearing rubber gloves is always a good idea. Contaminants are also floating around in the air, virtually invisible. There are thousands upon thousands of these undesirable microscopic organisms. The density of free-floating organisms in the air is generally much greater during spring and summer months than it is during the winter, and will also depend greatly on your local environment and climate and so on. Fighting airborne contaminants is important when you are inoculating or transferring cultures, and there are different ways to go about it. Laboratories often use high-efficiency particulate air filtration systems to clean the air. High-efficiency particulate air, or HEPA filters, are rated to remove 99.99% of all air particles over a certain size. This allows technicians to work in an environment virtually free of fungus and bacteria. In some labs, these filtration systems are built into the ceilings or walls so that an entire room is receiving filtered air. Many hobbyists build their own filter systems. Laminar flow hoods, as they are called, are built by combining a fan, a HEPA filter, and an airtight casing. The fan should be a squirrel cage type and be of sufficient blowing strength. Also, the casing must be well designed so that it is airtight. Details on how to build a flow hood at home are available on the internet. HEPA filters are available from large hardware stores, but they are not cheap. The mycologist works in the area in front of the filter where the clean air is blowing out. Larger filters allow for a larger work area. For most amateurs, much simpler and inexpensive methods are available. Glove boxes are cheap, simple, and effective. Simple glove box can be constructed from plastic totes with rubber gloves sealed around each armhole. Slightly less effective, but easy to make versions are cardboard boxes with armholes cut out and an openable plexiglass window fastened on with duct tape. Glove boxes should be used in combination with lots of bleach spray and/or aerosol disinfectant. First, Load the clean glove box with all of the items that will be needed. Then, close the lid and apply disinfectant in and around the glove box. Using clean, disinfected rubber gloves, perform the operations, resealing all the jars quickly. For the purposes of this video, some of the procedures will be shown in slightly less than ideal conditions, so that they can be seen better. Most of what you will see should be done under a laminar flow hood or inside a glove box, or in the very least, inside a small room such as a bathroom that has been cleaned thoroughly with disinfectant shortly beforehand. The rice flour and vermiculite cake method is the quickest way for beginners to grow many edible mushroom types. This method is also referred to as the PF Tech method, after Psilocybe fanaticus, the company that invented it. Mushroom cultures can be started with the tissue of the developed fruit body, a segment of mycelium, from a spore print, or from a spore syringe. I will be using a spore syringe, which I recommend for beginners because it's easy to use. Syringes and prints can be bought on the internet from reliable suppliers and can often be found in retail shops as well, depending on local laws. As well as a viable print or syringe, you will also need a pressure cooker, which can be bought at most department stores, organic brown rice flour, which can be bought at many health food stores, vermiculite, which can be bought at garden supply stores, and wide-mouth canning jars, which can be bought at hardware or department stores. You will also need tinfoil, distilled water, a hammer, and a small nail. Make sure your mason jars are slightly tapered. If they are not tapered, then the colonized substrate will not slide out properly when it is ready.
What was these jars? I never used these shaped jars before.
Start by punching holes in the lid caps. Do this over a block of wood with a hammer and a small nail. With the side with the rubber seal ring facing up, punch 2 holes opposite each other just inside the rubber seal ring of each lid cap. These holes are needed so that the substrate can be inoculated with a syringe afterwards, so make sure the holes are big enough for the needle tip. Syringe inoculation could be done by simply removing the entire lid, but using small pinholes is better because the lid will not need to be removed, and so the substrate will be less vulnerable to airborne contaminants. Now, mix your substrate in a large bowl. The amount of substrate to be used will depend on the number and size of the canning jars. Jars are usually sold in packs of 12. The jars shown here are 250 milliliters each. Each 250 milliliter jar will get about 3/4 of a cup of vermiculite, 1/4 cup of organic brown rice flour, and 1/4 cup of distilled water. Multiply those amounts by the number of jars. So for 12 250 milliliter jars, you will pre-mix in a bowl 9 cups of vermiculite, 3 cups of flour, and 3 cups of water. Mix thoroughly and consistently, and then fill each jar to within about 1/2 inch from the top. Do not pack the mixture into the jar. With these amounts, you should have a little bit left over afterwards. Wipe the top of the jar on the inside and outside if necessary, and then fill the last 1/2 inch of each jar with pure dry vermiculite. And put the lids on, making sure the rubber seal ring faces upward. Do not screw the lids on very tight. Instead, leave them slightly loose. Just turn them gently until they begin to tighten. Now place tinfoil over each jar top. The tinfoil will help protect against airborne contaminants after sterilization. The substrate jars are now ready to be sterilized. Make sure you have read the instructions for your pressure cooker and know how to use it properly. Pressure cookers operate at high temperature and high pressure and can be dangerous if used incorrectly. Load the cooker with as many jars that will fit, stacking them if there is room. Don't forget to add water to the cooker. Cook the jars for 1 full hour at 250 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 psi. Most simple pressure cookers will roughly maintain that temperature and pressure by design. So just turn the element on and wait for the steam release piece to shake rapidly, and then start counting down 1 hour. After that time, turn the heat off and let it cool for a few hours. Do not try to move the cooker until it has cooled down, which may take over 3 hours. If you like, perform the sterilization process in the evening and let the cooker cool down overnight. Leave the cooker closed and don't open it until it is in the inoculation area and you are ready to inoculate. Here we see 2 rye substrates, one before it is cooked and one after it is cooked. Inoculation should be done with the utmost of caution. From the moment the substrate jars are removed from the pressure cooker, they must be protected from contamination. Most contamination occurs at this stage during inoculation, often from germs that find their way onto the surface of the spore syringe or that are floating in the air. For this reason, we will wear clean rubber gloves, a dust mask, and clean clothes, and we will have an alcohol lamp or cigarette lighter to flame the needle tip before beginning inoculation. Now, for the purposes of viewing, this procedure will be shown out in the open, without any measures against airborne contaminants. Although the syringe method is not very vulnerable to airborne contaminants and should work fine in this open kitchen environment, it is much better to use a small bathroom or closet area that can easily be sterilized immediately before the inoculation procedure. This way, the air and surfaces will be virtually contaminant-free. Use a small bathroom and remove everything that isn't needed. Without opening it, bring the pressure cooker containing the substrate jars, as well as the spore syringe, a lighter, and a sealable plastic container or clean cardboard box into the bathroom. The container or box will be used to hold the jars afterward, so it should be an appropriate size and very clean. Close any windows and disinfect the area by spraying a generous amount of aerosol disinfectant or bleach solution into the air. Bleach can be mixed into a spray bottle in the amount of 1 part bleach for every 10 parts of water. Spray onto all of the surfaces in the room and into the air. After the room is sprayed, quickly close the door and leave. Let the area disinfect for 5 or 10 minutes and let the spray settle. Be mindful of paints, carpets, wallpapers, and other surfaces that will be ruined by bleach sprays. Also, keep in mind your own safety. Don't re-enter the sterilized room until most of the spray has settled. Finally, beware that aerosol disinfectant is flammable. Never use it near an open flame, such as an alcohol lamp. After this time, enter the room wearing clean clothes and a mask, and close the door quickly behind you. Goggles will help protect your eyes from stinging from bleach, but are not totally necessary. Remove the jars from the pressure cooker and place them on a surface where you have enough room to work. Once everything is in place, start by shaking the syringe to mix up the spores. Then, carefully remove the needle cap and flame the steel tip with a lighter for a couple seconds. Do not let the needle tip touch anything. If it does, flame it again. The key to successful inoculation, in combination with sterile conditions, is efficiency. The quicker you can remove the tinfoil from each substrate jar, inject it with inoculant, and replace the tinfoil without knocking anything over or touching the needle tip on anything, the better. Angle the syringe so that the needle tip touches the glass inside the jar. You can see the water run down the inside of the jar. Do 1 jar at a time and immediately move on to the next jar. A typical syringe holds 10 milliliters. If you have 12 jars, each with 2 holes, then use less than half a milliliter for each hole. If you have only a small batch of jars, then it is okay to use only half the contents of a syringe and then recap it for use later. Just make sure you flame the needle tip before and after replacing the cap. When all the jars are done, place them in the container or cardboard box and spray some more disinfectant for good measure. Place the lid on the container and leave the room for some fresh air. Now, all the hard work is finished, and the jars should be incubated. Incubation simply means for them to be stored in total darkness at a constant warm temperature. To ensure that no light reaches them, place them in an opaque box or garbage bag, or leave them in a pitch black room. The closer they are kept to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the better, but anywhere between 70 and 90 should be okay. Many growers use homemade incubating devices in which the temperature is carefully controlled, such as heated thermoses or modified refrigerators. Large-scale growers will heat an entire room for use as an incubation area. Temperature should be constant and unfluctuating. The closer it is to 86 degrees without going too much over, the faster the mycelium will grow. A substrate jar should take 10 to 15 days to fully colonize if incubated at 86 degrees, but will take 20 to 30 days if incubated around 75 degrees. During the incubation period, you will check from time to time on the progress of the mycelial growth. Check them every 3 or 4 days, but otherwise leave them to their darkness. Within a week or so of inoculation, mycelium will begin to form in small circles in the areas called inoculation points. In the following weeks, mycelium will grow outward until it colonizes the entire jar. While you are monitoring its progress, also be on the lookout for contaminants. Any strange discolorations or smells are an indication of contamination. The only exception to this is a bluish-purple discoloration that occurs where mycelium of Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms have been touched or bumped. However, bruising rarely occurs to mycelium that is contained in a jar. Blue bruising is normal for Psilocybe cubensis, but one must be able to distinguish it from a true contaminant. A clever incubation method for beginners is to place the substrate jars in a dark container directly on top of, or in the cupboard above, a fridge. You will notice the fridge creates warmth here. This is an ideal method for small incubation batches. Always use a thermometer just to be sure. Here is a simple homemade incubator made from a modified fridge. The fridge itself is not plugged in, but it is good because it is large, has shelves, and is dark and insulated. A light bulb, mounted in a separate chamber at the bottom, is wired to a thermostat. When the temperature drops below 86 degrees, the light comes on, creating heat. When it is warm enough, the light shuts off. This display shows the temperature inside the fridge. When full, this homemade incubator can hold hundreds of canning jars. Placing the culture in a cold fridge will keep the culture alive, but bring growth to a near standstill. This is useful if the grower needs to stall production or wants to preserve a culture for use in the future. During the time that your jars are incubating, build your terrarium. A terrarium is a semi-airtight chamber that will house the fully colonized substrate cakes during the final phases of growth when fruit bodies develop. Sealable plastic containers are ideal terrariums. If they are made of dark materials, or the lids are dark, then cut out a square hole and glue on a plexiglass window so that light is able to get in. Drilling small, quarter-inch holes along the bottom of the terrarium is good for air exchange. This will help to minimize carbon dioxide buildup, which will slow growth. Glass aquariums with plastic wrap or plexiglass for a lid can also be used, but may be unnecessarily heavy. The main function of a terrarium is to maintain high humidity. Mushrooms need high humidity throughout their life cycle. Humidity is retained while the substrate stays in the jar, but will need another source when removed from the jar. There are at least 3 ways to humidify a terrarium. 1 is the spray bottle method, 2 is to use a humidifier, and 3 is the perlite method. The spray bottle method requires the grower to spray water into the terrarium several times a day. A shield of some sort protects the substrate cakes from the spray, because direct water drops will harm mycelium. The spray bottle method is time-consuming and outdated. Many growers with large terrariums use electric humidifiers. A cool mist or vaporizer style humidifier, fixed with a short length of tubing to modify the flow of moisture, works well in many situations. However, for most small terrariums, complicated humidifier setups are unnecessary. A much easier method is the perlite method. This method works great, and there is virtually no maintenance. Simply line the bottom of a terrarium with a ½ inch of perlite that has been saturated with water. To saturate the perlite, place it into a large colander and dip it into a sink or a large bowl of water for a minute or 2, and then remove it and let it drain for 5 minutes. A small amount of peroxide can be mixed into the water to help keep it sterile. Pour the saturated perlite into the terrarium, spread it out evenly, and then cover it with a ½ inch layer of dry perlite. The perlite retains a great deal of water. Eventually, enough moisture will evaporate from the wet perlite to bring the relative humidity in the terrarium up to 100%. A hygrometer can be used to monitor the humidity. The relative humidity is the amount of moisture in the air measured on a scale from 0 to 100. A terrarium used to fruit rice flour and vermiculite cakes should be kept at or near 100% humidity. Anywhere from 85 to 100% humidity should be fine for a rice flour cake terrarium. Perlite humidification will achieve this easily. Experienced growers can guess the level of relative humidity by observing the density of moisture buildup that can be seen on the inner walls of the terrarium. Beware that inexpensive hygrometers are not always accurate. Fully saturated perlite will keep a terrarium humidified for weeks. If the perlite does dry out, simply apply more water. Be careful never to get drops of water directly on the cakes, because this could encourage contamination. Even though this humidification method requires no maintenance, it is still necessary for the grower to remove excess carbon dioxide. Do this by removing the lid once or twice daily and fanning. Carbon dioxide is heavy, so it will sit at the bottom of the terrarium along the perlite. Fan vigorously for 10 seconds or so, 2 to 3 times a day. Holes drilled along the bottom of the terrarium will help minimize unwanted carbon dioxide buildup. The effectiveness of the perlite method will depend on the volume of your terrarium. Anything larger than a regular-sized cooler may require more assertive humidification techniques. Soon after the substrate becomes fully colonized, it can be removed from the jar. Check the substrate one last time for contaminants. To remove the substrate, remove the lid and first scrape out the loose layer of vermiculite at the top of the jar. Turn the jar upside down. You may need to slam the jar down once or twice. A fully colonized substrate is not vulnerable to airborne contaminants because the mushroom mycelium is well established, and so other germs can't get a foothold. The colonized substrates will come out in a firm, solid cake. Touch the cakes as little as possible. Place them in the terrarium on top of the dome part of the lid or directly on the perlite. Space them a few inches apart so that the mushroom fruit bodies will have enough room to grow. If there are any droplets of water on the surfaces of the cakes, carefully remove them by dabbing them with a paper towel. You may notice that anywhere that the mycelium is touched or bumped, it will turn dark blue. This should not be mistaken for a contamination. In order to help initiate fruiting, the temperature in the terrarium should be about 10 degrees lower than what it was during incubation. If you incubated your substrate jars above the fridge, then place the terrarium on the floor where it is cooler. Normal room temperature is fine from here on in. If you are using a controlled temperature system, then lower the temperature from 86 degrees down to 76 degrees. The cakes should be exposed to light on a daily basis now. Indirect sunlight is fine, but make sure the light isn't causing the temperature in the terrarium to rise. Be sure to monitor the temperature and humidity in the terrarium constantly. Fluorescent light is also fine. Use a timer and set it to 12 hours on, 12 hours off. Keep in mind that mushrooms require light for a different reason than plants do. As long as there is at least a short period each day when the cultures are exposed to light, their needs are fulfilled. The duration of each daily light period will have little effect on the size of the harvest. Remember, once or twice each day, CO2 buildup should be removed by opening the lid and fanning the inside of the terrarium. Once the cakes have been in the terrarium for a couple weeks, dense mycelium masses on the surface will culminate in roundish balls with brown heads. These are the beginning of mushroom fruit bodies. Many of these balls will remain as small pinheads, whereas others will develop into full-sized mushrooms. Pinheads that don't develop are called aborts. Aborts are common. On each half-pint cake, you could have anywhere from 2 to 8 full-sized mushrooms develop. A small pin can develop into a 6-inch mushroom in a matter of days. Harvest a mushroom when the veil on the underside of the mushroom head is just beginning to tear. Hold a mushroom that is ready for harvest by the base and gently pluck it off. Most edible mushrooms can be eaten fresh, or they can be dried and stored. Proper drying is important. If they are not fully dried, they could become moldy, and mold could be poisonous if consumed. Simply laying them out on a plate or grill at room temperature should allow them to dry out, but it may take a few days. Other growers use desiccant in a chamber. Desiccant absorbs moisture. Placed in an airtight container with fresh mushrooms, it will absorb moisture from the air, effectively drying the mushrooms. Once properly dried, mushrooms can be stored for months and months. Rather than the rice flour and vermiculite cake method, which we have just learned, experienced growers will often use advanced growing techniques that will help them achieve larger yields. One advanced technique is to isolate a single mycelium genotype that has promising growth characteristics and use it alone as a source of inoculant. Some growers will dispute the advantages of isolating a single genotype, but most experienced growers notice much better fruiting ability from crops that come from single preferred genome strains. Another technique is to use rye seed as the substrate, which can easily be used to increase stalk culture at an exponential rate. One jar is used to inoculate 10 jars, and those 10 jars then inoculate 100 jars, and so on. This allows the grower to be in a state of perpetual harvest. Isolating a preferable genome type and using rye seed as substrate are techniques that can be used in combination or on their own. First, we will discuss the use of rye seed as a substrate, and then we will discuss the concept of isolating a single genotype strain with the use of agar media. Using rye seed is convenient because of its crumbly texture. This makes it easy to pour into other jars to inoculate them, or to pour it into trays where it can fruit. With rice flour and vermiculite, this would be impossible. By shaking the jars as the mycelium grows, the substrate won't become one single chunk, and pieces of colonized substrate can be poured into other jars or containers. One fully colonized rye seed jar can easily inoculate 10 more jars of the same size. Those 10 jars can then eventually inoculate 100 jars, and so on. This way, stock cultures can build fast. To prepare a rye substrate jar, pour the proper amount of rye seed and proper amount of water into large or medium-sized canning jars. As before, place the lids on the jars slightly loose for air exchange and with a rubber seal ring facing upward. Place tin foil over the top and cook jars in the pressure cooker for the standard time, 1 hour at 15 psi. When the pressure cooker has cooled to room temperature, in a clean environment, remove the jars and examine them closely for cracks. Discard any cracked jars. Tighten the lids and shake the jars well so that the cooked rye seed becomes loose and mixed up. After shaking, re-loosen the lids again for air exchange. They are now ready for inoculation. Use a syringe or a spore print for a multi-genome inoculation, or a wedge of mycelium on agar media for a single strain inoculation. If you are using a syringe, do it the same way as you would with a rice flour and vermiculite cake. As shown previously, pre-punch a hole or two in the lid for easy injection. If you are using a spore print, use an inoculating loop or a scalpel. Flame the instrument, let it cool, and scratch off a small amount from the print. Drop it off into the jar and quickly replace the lid. When it comes to inoculating a rye substrate, syringes are usually better than prints because print spores are too dry. Dry spores may not take hold in rye substrate as easily as the hydrated spores that come from a spore syringe. If you are using a mycelium wedge from a petri dish, use a sterilized scalpel and simply cut out the wedge and drop it into the substrate jar. Shaking the jar afterward will help disperse the mycelium. As the mycelium begins to develop and spread, every 2 or 3 days, the jars should be agitated to mix up the mycelium further and break up solid clumps. Shaking the jar may not always be enough. Banging it against a non-resistant surface such as an airless car tire or on a roll of duct tape both work well. But be careful. Always be watchful for damaged jars. You should be looking for contaminants when each jar is handled also, so keep a vigilant eye. When mycelium is growing fast, it is important that every few days each jar is dealt with so that the substrate clumps are broken down. If jars are left too long without being agitated, the substrate may become one solid clump and difficult to use. In about a week or two, when the entire jar is colonized, use each jar to inoculate about 10 other jars, which are prepared in the same way. To inoculate a new jar, start by checking the source jar for contaminants one last time, and then agitate it so that the entire contents can be poured. In a sterile area, or inside a glove box, carefully pour about 1/10 of the contents of the source jar into the new jar. Do it quickly and carefully. Replace the cap and shake the new jar and incubate it as you did the original. Using this method, it only takes a few weeks before you have hundreds of colonized substrate jars. At any time, a colonized substrate can be fruited, meaning it will be forced into the next phase of its life cycle and mushroom bodies will soon develop. This is achieved in part by a process called casing. In order for colonized rye seed to grow fruit bodies, it must be cased. This means covering it with a layer of peat or vermiculite, or something similar. The casing layer provides moisture and protection for the substrate and helps initiate the fruiting process. The casing layer can be applied directly to the substrate inside the jar, or else the substrate can be poured into a tray. The casing is then applied to the substrate in the tray. Casing is popular because it lends better to large-scale cultivation than the rice flour and vermiculite cake method does. The casing layer must be a non-nutritive substance like vermiculite or pH-balanced peat moss. Combining peat and vermiculite is also popular, and pre-sterilized pH-balanced soilless mix is very good. The mix should be pasteurized or sterilized first. To sterilize it, thoroughly moisten it and place it in a canning jar with the lid on loose or in a pillowcase and cook it in the pressure cooker for 1 hour at 15 psi. Let it cool and keep it in the jar or pressure cooker until it is to be used. Prepare a tray for the substrate to be poured into. Trays can be metal or plastic and should be sterile. It is best if they are opaque. Semi-clear Tupperware containers may need to be wrapped with tape or plastic so that light is kept out. Take a colonized rye jar or several of them and loosen up the substrate. Empty the substrate jars into the tray until the tray is full. Use the jar to pat down and crumble any large chunks. The substrate should lay out mostly even. Cover it with a thin depth of casing material. The depth of the casing layer should be about 1/4 of that of the substrate layer. For the first few days, the casing should be kept in the darkness at 86 degrees Fahrenheit, the same conditions as before. Cover the top with an aerated lid or put the casing in a humidified terrarium so the casing won't dry out. Mist the casing layer gently, once every day or so. The mycelium may grow fast, and some spots may see more growth than others. In this case, growers like to do something called patching. Patching is covering the areas where mycelium grows early with more casing. This beats back the areas of fast mycelial growth, so the entire surface can develop at the same time. Timing is critical for the next step. Here, the grower will change 3 variables to the mushroom environment: temperature, light exposure, and fresh air exposure. This will cause the mushroom culture to shift into fruiting mode. The temperature is dropped 10 degrees, from 86 degrees Fahrenheit to 76 degrees Fahrenheit, by removing the culture from the incubator. Light is introduced. A small fluorescent on a timer set for 12 hours on, 12 hours off is fine. Fresh air is increased. This is achieved by placing the casing in a terrarium where aeration is good but humidity remains high. It may be necessary to fan the casing a few times each day to remove carbon dioxide buildup. These changes should be made when the mycelium can be seen evenly throughout the casing, but before it is well established. If it is done too late, then the mycelium will overlay the casing layer, and fruits will not develop. Within a couple of weeks, fruit bodies will appear. Harvest them as you would with the mushrooms that grow on rice flour and vermiculite cakes. In order to understand why and how a genetic strain is isolated, let us first look at the natural growth cycle. When using a spore print or a syringe to inoculate a substrate, it is referred to as a multispore inoculation. This is because dozens, perhaps thousands of spores are introduced to the substrate. Each spore that germinates will develop into primary mycelia, termed monokaryotic mycelia. These primary strains will then pair into secondary mycelia strains, termed dikaryotic. Only dikaryotic strains can bear fruit. Each dikaryotic strain will have a unique genetic makeup, or genome type. These different genome types will often have noticeably different growth characteristics, some of which are known to fruit better than others. In particular, ropey, strand-like mycelium is better than solid, fuzzy types. Ropey, strand-like structures are called rhizomorphs, and these are what cultivators look for. In a typical multispore culture, there is usually the presence of both fuzzy-type strains as well as the rhizomorphic. By extracting a sample of the more promising rhizomorphic strains and using it as inoculant, growers can be assured of better fruiting potential in the end. Some growers claim that isolating a single genome strain will also reduce the chances of detrimental competition among different genome types. In order to isolate a single, secondary mycelial strain with preferable growth characteristics, growers most often use petri dishes in agar media. Agar media is made from seaweed extract and potato dextrose and can be poured into a petri dish where it will solidify like jello. Agar media on petri dishes is ideal for isolating strains because mycelium is so much easier to see and extract from a petri dish than it is from a jar. Agar media comes in a dehydrated powder form and can be bought from science supply stores, spore suppliers, or can be made at home from recipes widely available on the internet. A small bottle will cost $10 or $20 and will go a long way. The most common type is potato dextrose agar, or PDA. Preparing agar media is similar to making jello. Unless it is otherwise directed on the label, combine about 10 grams of PDA powder with about 250 milliliters of distilled water and mix it together well in a canning jar. PDA is not harmful, so using gloves is not necessary. Place the cap on the canning jar with the rubber ring facing upward, but do not seal it tight. Instead, leave the cap somewhat loose, and cover the top with tin foil. Place the jar into the pressure cooker, and, following the directions of the pressure cooker, cook it at 15 psi for 1 full hour. After the cooker has cooled enough that it can be safely opened, remove the jar using oven mitts. If the agar media is to be poured into dishes, then this must be done before it cools down enough to solidify. However, be careful never to open the pressure cooker while it still has internal pressure.
Okay, ready?
Agar can be poured into flat petri dishes, test tube slants, small baby food jars, or it could be left to solidify in the jar it was cooked in. But for the purposes of growing mycelium in order to find and isolate a particular genotype, flat petri dishes are best because the mycelium grows on a flat, two-dimensional plane, and so it can be easily seen and extracted. Pour the media into petri dishes in a sterile environment. Stack dishes 3 or 4 high and use a continuous, repetitive motion, leaving their lids off for as little time as possible. This will minimize the potential for contaminants. Take care not to overfill the dishes. Carefully place the filled dishes into a plastic baggie or clean Tupperware container for extra protection, and place them somewhere cool to solidify. It may be a good idea to wait 3 or 4 days before inoculating them to make sure no contamination occurred during the pouring procedure. Any growth or discoloration that occurs on the media is a contamination. To inoculate the agar media, take proper precautions. Do it in a sterile area and sterilize metal tools with a flame. Use a small scraping from a spore print or a drop from a spore syringe and deposit it onto the agar media. Replace the lid on the agar media quickly. Spores from a print or syringe will result in multiple genome types intermingled. For a single, dikaryotic strain to be the result, you can inoculate the agar media with a freshly dissected piece of live fruit body tissue or with a segment of mycelium from another agar culture. Once it has been inoculated, incubate the new agar culture in darkness at 86 degrees Fahrenheit for fast growth, just as you would a rice flour and vermiculite cake substrate. Or, to halt growth so that the culture can be stored for long periods, put it in the fridge shortly after the mycelium begins to grow. This way, preferred strains can be preserved for months and years. To begin a batch culture from a single genotype, find a healthy sector of mycelium that exhibits the preferred qualities. Avoid fuzzy, cottony type mycelium. Look for ropey, rhizomorphic strands. Presumably, the sector will contain mycelium from one single dikaryotic strain only. To extract it, use a scalpel or a knife that has been heat sterilized. Flame the blade until it glows, and then, after it is cooled for several seconds, cut out a wedge from the good area. Stay away from the side of the dish and make 3 clean cuts. Pick the wedge up by spearheading it in the middle. Hypothetically, you could take 2 wedges from the same rhizomorphic growth area, one to inoculate a rye seed jar, and the other to inoculate a slant or another petri dish. The rye jar is used to start a mass stock culture, and the slant or petri dish is placed in the fridge for long-time storage and future use. While some growers will always use the petri dish step first, so that the initial inoculation will be from a single preferred genotype, any grow technique can be carried out with a multispore source. This means that the petri dish step can be skipped, and it is okay to use a syringe or spore print to directly inoculate a substrate. The difference will be, if you have a good, isolated strain, all of your mycelium and fruits should look and grow similar, and likely they will have strong fruiting abilities. Whereas with a multispore source, the substrates and fruits may grow very dissimilarly, and fruits may not be as plentiful. Growers have success with both methods, though experts seem to prefer to take time and select for more promising genotypes. Welcome to Mushroom Growing Made Easy. In this 1-hour program, we will learn general techniques for propagating and fruiting mushrooms at home. Among the edible mushrooms that can be grown with the methods shown in this video are Psilocybe cubensis. Psilocybe cubensis are just one of the many species of mushrooms that contain psilocybin and psilocin, two psychoactive substances that make them hallucinogenic. Psilocybe cubensis mushrooms, which are also known as Cubensis stropharia, are likely the most commonly grown mushroom among home cultivators. This is probably because they were so easy to grow. Mushrooms containing psilocybin and psilocin have been used recreationally and ritualistically for thousands of years. So, unlike many modern chemical drugs, the test of time has proven species such as cubensis to be relatively harmless and non-toxic when used in moderation. Nobody has ever been known to overdose on them. However, because they are all of what you will see in this video can be done at home without any expensive equipment. The only major item that you will need, besides mushroom spores, is a pressure cooker. A small one, brand new, will cost $60 or $70 at a department store. Mushrooms need very little space and very little light. So, unlike growing plants, electricity consumption is next to nothing. As well, contrary to what most people believe, with most grow methods, there is no need for manure or smelly composts. There are two main goals for the mushroom cultivator to achieve. One is to recreate, at home, the environmental conditions that allow mushrooms to flourish in nature. For example, the jar shown here contains a certain amount of nutrients, a certain amount of humidity, and will be stored at a certain temperature. Now, while these conditions are ideal for mushroom fungus, they are also ideal for countless other types of bacteria and fungus. That's where the other goal comes in. The second goal of the mushroom cultivator is to protect this ideal environment from contamination. If any such organisms, other than the intended mushroom fungus, do so powerfully psychoactive, care and responsibility are always key when it comes to using them safely. Anyone who has limited experience with hallucinogenic mushrooms should not take for granted or underestimate their psychoactive power. Magic mushrooms must be respected. Furthermore, the production of psilocybin and psilocin is illegal in many countries, including Canada and the US. If you grow Psilocybe cubensis, do it in a country where it is not illegal. Also, many species of mushrooms are highly poisonous, so finding mushrooms in the wild or buying them on the black market can be dangerous unless you are an expert who can identify them beyond any doubt. For these reasons, buying spores from reputable suppliers and growing them at home is the safest method of obtaining them. Even then, care must be taken during the cultivation process so that no contaminations develop. Contaminated mushrooms may also pose a personal health risk to the user. However, this is easy enough to deal with if you know what to look for. Taking a little time and care is all that is needed to ensure that you can grow and eat edible mushrooms and be safe. Find their way into this jar, and they will try, then there is little chance that the mushroom fungus will survive. That is why so much attention is paid to sterile techniques in mushroom cultivation. The life cycle of a mushroom begins when thousands of spores are released from the gills of a mature mushroom before it dies. The spore is the beginning point of the life cycle. Spores that germinate will grow silky white fungus called mycelium. When the mycelium of two compatible spores meet, their genetic makeups are combined to create a secondary mycelium, which will expand further and eventually become the physical and nutritional foundation on which fruit bodies will grow. The fruit bodies are the actual mushrooms. When the fruit bodies become fully developed, they will drop thousands of spores, and thus the cycle continues. Starting with a spore print or syringe, the entire growth cycle for Psilocybe cubensis can be as short as 8 weeks from start to finish, if conditions are ideal. First, you will mix a suitable substrate and use it to fill several jars. The substrate is what the mushroom fungus will feed off, and usually is a simple mixture of water and rye seed, or water, vermiculite, and rice flour. Many other mixtures can be used, but these two are the most common. The substrate jars are then sterilized to kill any viruses, bacteria, or funguses that are certain to be laced heavily within the substrate. Sterilization is done with a pressure cooker. It is after this step that sterile technique is so important so that the substrate remains free of any rival organisms. Sterile technique means taking certain precautions and doing things in such a way that the substrates will not be exposed to any contaminants. More on sterile technique in a moment. When the jars have cooled down after the sterilization process, the mushroom spores can be introduced. This is called inoculation. Inoculate the jars by injecting them with a spore syringe, or by dropping in a scraping from a spore print or a piece of live tissue. This will cause the mushroom fungus to eventually grow all over the substrate. In order for it to grow fast, however, the substrate jar must be incubated. This means simply to keep it somewhere